just a fitting beginning, I would say, for this crazy year. I'm so pleased to be able to introduce these two poets, both of whom I now consider friends, and to tell you a little bit about them before they read to us. Katharine Coles, whom I've known, I believe now for 30 or more years, is the author of 7 collections of poetry, most recently Wayward from Red Hen Press, and 2 more forthcoming. She's also the author of 2 nonfiction books, a memoir, Look Both Ways, and a forthcoming collection of essays, The Stranger I Become, Essays in Reckless Poetics, both from Turtle Point Press. Her work has been widely translated, and she's been widely published in both the UK and in Australia. She served from 2006 to 2012 as the Utah Poet Laureate, and in 2009 and 2010 as the inaugural director of the Poetry Foundation's Harriet Monroe Poetry Institute. In 2018 and 19, she participated in the Poets House fieldwork project as the poet in residence at the Natural History Museum of Utah and the Salt Lake Public Library. She has received grants and awards from the National Endowment of the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Guggenheim Foundation, and is a wonderful teacher and a wonderful friend to both the people who call themselves her friends, but also to her students, her many, many students. I'm going to introduce you both, and then I'm going to let the reading just unfold. So Anna Scotti is a poet, writer, and teacher who lives in Southern California. She's received a number of awards and honors for her writing and has been published in the New Yorker and elsewhere. Bewildered by All This Broken Sky is her very first collection of poems, spanning more than 10 years of work. Ellen Bass said of Anna's work, suffused with beauty, pulsing with life, these poems invite us to see the ordinary, the broken, as miraculous. Her prose poems are small masterpieces. She's also a fiction writer, and she published a young adult novel, Big and Bad, last year. And School Library Journal noted that only a seasoned poet could take readers on such a powerful journey in so few words. This book, it was recently announced, was a co-winner of the Patterson Prize for Young Adult Fiction. And she has written short stories that appear in many, many places and genres, including the Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine. Anna teaches at a French international school and holds degrees from Antioch College, Ohio, and Antioch University, Los Angeles. Kate will read to us first, and then Anna. So think of your questions and hold them and put them in the Q&A. Let's start with Kate.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and thanks, Anna, for reading with me. I agree with what Ellen Bass says about your poems. I can't wait to hear them. I'm just delighted to be here. And I want to acknowledge Paisley Reckdahl, whose brainchild this event is. It's been wonderful since she began it either 3 or 4 years ago. And I know that Lisa and many others work very hard as well to make this possible. So thank you for having me. A number of years ago, I woke up and discovered that in the eyes of the world, I'd become a feminist poet. And I'll admit that this bugged me at first. And I think this is just because poets don't like to be put in boxes, or at least I don't. But after a while, I thought, well, I am a feminist, visibly so, and a poet, so why not? More recently, I'm being called an environmental poet, or sometimes an eco-poet. I don't think of myself in these terms either, though I am a poet, and I do like to go outside, and I do live in the world that is being ruined around us. And so I think that we have to accept where we're located and what we're doing in that place. On an interview yesterday, I said to Laura Jones that I consider myself really to be a poet who's interested in perception above all, in how we use our senses and our language to make sense of the world, and how our individual lenses both enable and distort our sense making. And I think if you're engaging the world as it is around you, then you're engaging in all the discussions that are happening there. Lately, I've been watching and thinking a lot about animals, and I'll be reading a number of animal poems this evening. So I want to begin with this quote from Samantha Peel that arrested my attention because it addresses some of the problems we face when we try to write about or to or from another creature. Samantha says, "For me, the word portrait fails to convey the emotions portrayed in art inspired by a person or an animal." I'll start with living wild. Living wild, not being. Beauty is a defiance of authority, feral of falling back into arms I trust, returning to something not the same thing. Fetching, I incline to fleece and flannel, raise myself each morning and feel flight in daylight, flight refining stars or meteors, body not defined one way. What ruffles feathers? What my mind? If I prowl free among trees and grasses or traversing the pavements, I'm the catch. Long view. Back when I wondered what I had to do, I knew I would know it when I saw it. The way I would know a lion flicking her tail in the grass had fixed her desire on me. Back then, each day opened itself, brilliant and blank as empty glass. This I knew of beauty, its hunger, its delicate provocations. And yes, I believed the day waited to be filled, and me to fill it. Only how would I ever open myself so far? How could I pour without spilling? For a long time, when people asked me to describe my poems, I said that I wrote long poems about science, art, and history. And my husband at one point said, "You have to stop saying that. Nobody will ever read your poems." And it was a pleasure to wake up one day and realize that I was writing almost exclusively short poems. This is Animal. One can die. One can die. This numinous skin, the way flesh becomes everything and everything around it, taken in, including all it's not, but may anticipate or imagine, including drag its belly, including perform 100 push-ups on a rock and sun shining, all in a day's work, and curling up at day's end into a ball of self, under a leaf or thicket of softest green, waking again, noticing the sun has risen. Not another day keeps coming up new, going by. One thing I think that Anna and I share is a love of birds. And Chris and I welcomed a new bird into our house just 2 years ago now, at the time a baby Senegal parrot, who's now a quite annoying adolescent. This is written out of pleasure in his presence and also out of the wearingness of the griefs of the long year that we've just spent, at the beginning of which my father died. So it's also, I guess, about that. Sick of grief, especially mine. Look outside, look in. Our Henry whistles up his flock across a jungle, and I answer. One will outlive the other, and song continue. We love where we are loved. We don't nest in treetops, of course. Ceilings and floors divide us. Staircases and doors open up and through. You know what I mean. If not, imagine a small bird in the window, fanning open green and yellow wings for me to admire. Green leaves dazzling, yellow sun, come on. And then also for Henry, small song. I have a ghost at my shoulder. I wear his heart on my sleeve. I keep him to hand and fold his wings under my ribs. He calls, his voice a sharp green shadow, voice a scarlet blazon through the trees, which branch and crown in us and rustle gently in the breeze. So with that, we make a move to trees for a minute or two. Excuse me, I am allergic to pollen, and this has been a hard afternoon. This is for my friend and colleague Tom Stillinger, who we were editing something together, and he loved a poem that I also loved, and he said, but I just don't know what to do with these ETH verbs. So this is for him, and it's called Passeth. The apple doesn't come from nowhere, or for that matter, anywhere. And the tree also counts its days, or counteth, as the case may be, enumeration elevated by grammar and the world filling itself with never enough jokes. How many sunrises since last frost? How many to go until it's safe to let loose, statistically speaking? The trees want their blossoms there and gone unfoldings, not to freeze, want to pull water through their fibers into what transpires and make sunlight raw material. Don't we all want to feel fingertips plump into fruit? If this turn strikes you as fanciful, don't think so much. Only palms full, only sweetness filling your hands, then too muchness you can count on. Recount as night lengthens and its shiver takes you. And it is, of course, the time for the trees to be blossoming. Our cherries are in blossom right now. But I'm sticking with apples and moving to late fall. This is called ghost apples. And the phenomenon that the poem describes is real. You can Google it and see pictures. Ghost apples. The ones we ate, we shouldn't have yet. The ones we imagined eating. The ones we left too long on the bough until the rain froze around them and they slipped out the bottom, leaving behind perfect crystal shapes, present and absent, clear mysteries, bodies made transparent vessels of the sun, and in the sun, their own soft robes vanishing light. Like anyone, I'd rather go around in my own skin, and yet we don't. Once I bit an apple. It bit me back. And now we're going for trees and animals at the same time. The biologist here at the University of Utah, Phyllis Coley, and I were talking at one of those university functions with little plastic cups of wine. And she was telling me about her work, which this poem is based on in some ways. And she kept talking about the worms in the trees. And I went home and I wrote this poem called Worm for her. And then I sent it to her with some trepidation, as always, when you are pirating a scientist's work, you're a little bit nervous about what they're going to say. And she emailed back and she said, well, you know, they're not worms. They're in the trees. They're caterpillars. And I said, well, Phyllis, you kept calling them worms. That's what you called them. And she said, oh, well, that's because that's what my mother called them. So the poem is still titled Worm, but there are caterpillars now also appearing in it. You've heard a number of sonnets already so far, and this poem is 2 sonnets, and I'll just lift a finger when we're jumping from one to the other. Worm. It works its way through the canopy. Leaf by leaf, it ruminates on what its body makes. Trees chew over news and light, muttering, but the leaf can't escape. If it thinks, the leaf imagines being chewed apart, dismemberment enacted, routine. how to shrug off, how repel. Above deep shade emanates blue and dazzle, but neither leaf nor caterpillar knows a thing about light scattering, or do they? Or that when I take to the tops of trees, I want to fly, but fall. Beneath, they occupy themselves. Caterpillar, leaf, it consumes in time. Why should they be different than we are in this way, each selved, absorbed, at work? The caterpillar might turn into a metaphor for whatever grows and eats, whatever rustles and fights the other off or fails, but it remains itself, stubborn. Metaphor extends itself or sticks it to us while we grieve the body, our minds consumed with it. We feed ourselves on ourselves. This morning and every morning, I clean my teeth, preparing them, failing, becoming already part of the feast. This poem is actually part of a collaborative project that will be launching on Zoom. I was going to say that will be performed, but it's already been performed and taped. It will be launching on Zoom on Earth Day, April 22nd. And I'd like to call your attention to this project. It's Artivism for Earth. You can Google it. It starts at noon on the 22nd, and it goes all day and through the evening. My part is in the evening, but the part that I'm most excited about is actually at 1 o'clock, which will feature collaborations by a number of University of Utah graduate students in creative writing, also in composition, music, visual art, etc. This poem was set to music by Javier Beteta and is sung by a wonderful child soprano in the collaboration. It's called Whale Fall. Because they live in the dark, mostly they live in their ears, listening, singing back. We drop microphones and eavesdrop below the surface, letting them make us fishers of sound. They surface when they want and bob, pointing their eyes at us in our strange vessels and bright flotation vests. Why don't we come on in? They flip and dive and return, great temptresses, and wink. And finally, when they've exhausted our capacity to amuse them, roll their vastness into greater vastness. Because they sometimes throw themselves onto our shores, enormous, evacuated, where they never meant to be, and like any body, stink. We think we know their fates. But when they come to their ends in deep waters, like us, alone, they sink back to where they came from, out of sight and deep, where we all come from, whether or not we end there. Then I'm going to end with this little 3-part poem. And once again, I'll lift up my finger when I'm moving from part to part. It's called Jetsam, but all of the versions of Jetson are featured in the poem, named in the poem, will come along. Jetson, Jetsam, and then I'll be done. What we owned before we tossed it. What lightens the vessel, sailing where we wish, remaining blithe and going. Being what we let go on purpose, now that it no longer serves our needs. Unlike Lagan, Jetsam also floats, floating the point. If we choose not to keep it, why not send it wherever? We can only save ourselves. Watch the horizon, why not? Wafting toward it, going over there. Not flotsam then, not what sinks then rises again to haunt us. Not what we lose by capsize, being wreckage. Don't call it misadventure, to plunge deep into dark sounding, then release your goodies in pieces back to the surface, keeping what isn't buoyant enough to float. Not a body then, which will, thinking glissers, thinking hold. Not derelict either, as in sunk, just gone, or beyond recovery, as in my voice, its song. All I've left, I warble. The waters sing, so long, so long. Thank you. And then Anna, I think, is next.
There we go. That was very beautiful, Katharine. Really beautiful. I enjoyed that a lot. The first poem I'll read tonight originally appeared in the Crab Creek Review, and it is the first poem in the collection. Now that I have known loss, so many summers ago that I doubt you are alive to recognize yourself, the old Galahad of my poem. But let's start with the baby, pushing her own stroller with fat starfish hands, while you, sullen neighbor of neatly drawn drapes and noise complaints, carried a bag of trash as tidy and neatly knotted as yourself, frowning as if even a sour nod might cost you, as if the sun weren't beating glitter from the sidewalk, scattering diamonds in our path. How odd to find myself the villain and never know until this moment. I'll admit I was a barefoot slattern of a mother. I'll admit I should have kept that fat hand tucked tight within my own. She knocked the stroller down our steep drive, and you leapt, slipped, and rose in bloody triumph, stroller clutched in a gnarled fist, to find the child safe against my knee. How odd to realize now that old men are just men, as foolish with chivalry as any callow 19. Now that I have known loss, I know what you wished to spare us. Now that my bones ache, I know what that leap cost you, and the reckoning. My daughter's bright, sharp laugh, my pretty hand extended as you sprawled, cursing, casting shadows in the drive. Thank you. The next poem is called Onomatopoeia. Readers familiar with my work probably think of me as a free verse poet, but I do enjoy formal poetry and rhyming poetry. This one is called Onomatopoeia, and it is the oldest poem in the collection. So, Promise is a girl in a loose summer dress, hands folded neatly into heart-shaped fists. Fist is a boy, clenched tight and hard, with bitten nails scuffed and scarred. Promise is a girl with scars at her wrists, hands folded neatly into heart-shaped fists. Heart is a muscle, thick and veined with blue. Blue is her dress and her eyes, and a bruise. Bruise is the taste of a plum or a peach, a stone at its heart, but yielding and sweet. Stone is as hard and as smooth as a fist, clean like a promise, like that first sweet kiss. The next poem that I would like to read first appeared in the New Yorker about a year ago, and it has been widely circulated. So I thought that I would read it tonight. Then Fall Again. Orange, gold, crunch, crisp. Apples cut in clean crescents, burnt marshmallow, smoke caught in the folds of our jackets, in our hair. Luminaria pumpkins like ambassadors of the season, a mustache drawn with scorched cork, then a pilgrim's hat of black and white, cranberries bright as blood, a cold drift from beneath the door, crackle of ice. Spring, finally. Silly to think all this could end when everything is bursting. Buds furled tight along the branch, wet and new, a girl's soft hair, hard-soled shoes, rain against the pane and the smell of cut grass, loam and soil and sod, blossoms on the sidewalk, petals on our shoulders, and days to spend, days to waste, hours sifted through our fingers like spilled sugar from the bowl. Then summer's small fruits, hard and sour. Hot sidewalk, hot forehead, hot breath of August at the window, and still no way to warm you. Huddled at the heater, stifling wool and cups of tea and soup and steam, stained sweaters, stinking socks, tissues knotted on the floor, and all the ways we meant to say goodbye forgotten. No ferry now to Coronado, no starlit swim to Mazatlan. Nothing matters but to make you warm. Then fall again. Orange, gold, crunch, crisp. Bones and stones and broken brown leaves. One without you, then all the rest the same. Thank you. I wrote this next poem for my friend, Kathy, and it first appeared in the Adirondack Review. Away. Crouching there by the bald-back tire, you might be pulling roots from the black earth, shooting craps, stirring the ashes of some archaic fire, or tracing letters in the thickening soil, smelling leaves and bone and loam rising against the swelling heat. Your cheek is a wing, soft against the cool fender. Last time, the shriek of crows, each blade of grass. Now your fingers curl about a stiff cut hose, each separate and determined to make this thing happen. You released a falcon once, palms spread wide, pushing him up into steep canyons of silvered clouds. Your dogs will be snapping in the side yard soon, fearful and reluctant, but hunger tamed against the whispering uniforms, the jangled steel, the deadening odor stirred by a thin breeze, mingling with milk flowers, evanescent and away. Feathers of Gold. If you're a parent, this poem will probably speak to you. I think you'll remember what I'm writing about. Feathers of Gold. Last night you came to me barefoot, nightgown damp and twisted with sleep, and said you'd lost a thing with 4 rooms and no doors. That's easy, I said, your heart. Last night you turned, pushing the dark from your eyes with both fists. I'm calling and calling, but only my own voice answers. And I smoothed the blankets around you and whispered, echoes on water, feathers of gold. Last night you muttered, an acorn, a chestnut, and many eyes but cannot see. And I knew that you would cry out, still trembling from dreams of sphinxes and corridors, deserts, hot breath. Hush, I told you, never, forever. The ocean, I will. And I should have mentioned that poem first appeared in Nimrod, and it is in the collection. When you are a child whose parent is a poet, you see your childhood reflected in your parents' poetry. And my daughter has been a pretty good sport about that. This one is called 12, and it was my own father's favorite. It first appeared in the Comstock Review. 12th. So there you are, cross-legged, patient fingers working tangles from the silky plume of the dog's tail, mouth set in a stern love line, exactly like my grandmother's. You've already learned that love is mostly duty, gathering worms after every rainfall, laying countless broken birds to rest in tissued boxes, grim as any village preacher. You've scabbed knees, bitten nails, yet the new teacher's eyes can't quite meet mine. Don't let all that beauty confuse you. There will be a boy who does not love you, then a man, and someday a child, willful as a wind-born spirit, slamming doors and windows, raging like a storm at sea, raging but so far from you, then curled in a sullen circle of music, friends, secrets that exclude you. And I'll be a photograph on the dresser, a folded note beneath a stack of silken scarves. Maybe this note. So listen now, your mother is speaking. Don't flinch in the face of all that angry beauty. Breathe. Know what it is to have love enough to squander. Thank you. So many people have suffered loss in the past year. I thought this poem might resonate. I wrote it for my sister when she was dying a year ago in March. I'll meet you when I can. You'll be settled in this narrow bed, bleached sheets taut against your restless feet, as we offer chips of ice and stricken looks, your scalp a tender pink beneath the sparse silk of your hair. But who's to say you're there? Curled in a green gown, who's to say you're not remembering a triple somersault down the hill, dry grass and leaves caught in your tangled hair, and your brother calling, fingers cupped carefully about a beetle's furious wings, or liver-dappled hands, sketching Gibson girls with high-button collars and piled-up hair as you snatch green grapes from the deep freeze, miniature globes of sour sherbet in taut frosted skins, and peaches, fragrant in a basket by the door, greedy ducks waddling ashore from a lake smooth and brown as chocolate in a cup, and gleaming patent leather shoes, white one year, black the next. You'll remember picking mulberries from a low branch and standing calf deep in the ocean, waves breaking all around, cry of gull, crescent sun, salt and sand glittering like sugar in your hand. Before the end, before the whole world is a cracked ceiling and a cranked bed, you'll recall your uncle's wheeze, a wrapped butterscotch from his breast pocket, your father's spavined knuckles cradling a child's skull more gently than you'd known a man could hold anything. You'll remember forsythia clustered bright against a sea gray sky, and a bird with scarlet breast, yellow throat swelled with song. Once you waded barefoot in a creek of moss-limed stones. Twilight settled, soft and blue as the flicker of the neighbor's TV, and a screen door slammed. I'm trying to ask you not to be afraid. There's a fringed buckskin jacket, a boy's soft mouth and a silver chain, and passing a wet roach until your fingertips burned. Your son on tiptoe to reach the highest branch. Your fingers broad and strong, tamping soil around sapling roots, knotting string, tying a sash the color of the bright, cloudless sky that hangs over us now. There's your mother's blue-veined hand, soft as a wing laid on your own. Stay a while. And your husband calling from the garden, honeybees, drowsy and heavy with nectar, a flash of fish from a dappled pond, a dish of berries on a low table, your daughter's cool fingers in your hair. Then wind, and you'll feel the wind cold and bright against your chapped cheeks, your bony knees bracing your small sister on either side, strong arms around her as the toboggan rocks and bucks, snow spray sparkling on your mittens and in your tangled hair, and our laughter rising, rising. Thank you. Excuse me. The last poem I'd like to read tonight first appeared in Sequestrum, and I learned, excuse me, I learned just a couple of days ago that it won an honor in the Margaret Reed poetry competition for formal poems. It's called DC 1978. And it was inspired by Leslie Poles Hartley, who said, "The past is a foreign country." DC 1978. The past is another country. You can barely recall your brief stay, stacking chipped red bricks and boards for shelves in a room at the end of a hall. Painting sagging walls white in rooms so full of light, the rusted screens couldn't hold it all. While down the block, dogs barked warnings to the night. And there you are, leaning far out the window to call down to a boy who smoked and loved to fight and drive fast, a boy the girls said really got around. He never made it out. He lives only in that lost place, a cramped apartment in your hometown, and in his mother's candles, in her bewildered face. The past is a country of fruit-bright sky and bursting dawns, where you tiptoed home, carelessly laced sandals slung over one finger, across dew-wet lawns, to find your sister awake, breathless, admiring and shy, your parents safe in their dull bed, radio on, the front door bolted shut, but every window flung wide. Thank you very much.
Katharine, do you want to join us now for some questions? Thank you both for such beautiful readings. I'm going to start with a question, and then there are a few in the Q&A. I loved what you said, Kate, about you're being a poet of perception and sense making. And I think that I see a bridge, although maybe your modalities are different, between the two of you in that regard. One of my favorite poems in Anna's collection is, I have to look, it has a very long title. It's or maybe it's for Elise banged out on a cheap electric organ with sand and cracker crumbs jammed between the keys. That's full of gorgeous observation and language and color. Could you both talk a little bit about what noticing means to you as a poet?
Anna, I can't see Anna. Can everyone else see her? You can?
Yeah, she's
fine, Katharine. Yeah.
All right, then I won't worry about it. I was going to ask you, Anna, if you wanted, there you are, if you wanted to start.
I will start. Noticing. I think that most of us poets are also teachers, and it's something that we teach our students, children and adults, and that we maybe it comes naturally to us, or maybe we have to remind ourselves to notice everything around us all the time, even when we're in a hurry. There is so much beauty in the world. And if you open your eyes and open your ears, there it is waiting for you. And I think that's what poetry is, maybe distilling those moments into something that other people can recognize and enjoy, and to try to evoke the same emotion in them that maybe you felt when you experienced it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would also say that for me, as I have become more aware of what poem making is for me, because, for a long time I made poems without being able particularly to articulate or think well about that. Excuse me. I think that one of the things that I'm really trying to do is navigate for myself the space between what's out there. And I'm noticing right now that the sun is setting in my face, and I hope that's wonderful for all of you and not really distracting. So, but the space out there where the sun is setting before me, and the space, the interior space that I'm sort of muddled around in, living with, paying attention to all the time. And I will say that I think that poets tend to have very rich inner lives, as well as very rich external or noticing lives. So what I'm trying to think about all the time is how those things come together and how language brings them together. But I'm also very interested in the science of how those things come together, the science of vision and perception, how the perceptual apparatus works, how the mind is much larger than the brain and even larger than the body. So I'm constantly, as I'm working with the exterior elements and the interior elements of the poem, I'm constantly trying to navigate or manage that liminal space between what's outside and what's inside. And then Anna, I think, really wonderfully talked about then what you're trying to do is open a space for an experience for a reader. And also, as I've gotten older as a poet, I'm much more willing to be called a feminist poet, to be called an eco-poet, but basically to let the reader take whatever I've done and bring the reader's whole self into that space in order to have an experience that I could never have in that poem. And that it is absolutely unique to the reader in the poem. And when I read Anna's poems, even though I recognized that they're actually in many ways much different from mine, that was the experience that I was having that really distinguished them from so many of the poems that I'd been reading around that time.
Thank you both. I have some questions from the Q&A that I'd like to convey to you. So first of all, compliments to all of you. You both look lovely. That's a compliment in the questions. This is a question for Kate, but I think it's also a question that Anna could answer profitably. Do you find that your poems have a season? Do you find yourself writing more into the human condition and the natural world more than you did prior to the pandemic? And what patterns have you noticed in your work in the last year? Oh, was I muted the whole time?
No, we heard you.
We're thinking, and I'm waiting for Katharine to take that.
Okay, she wants me to start. So this is a very hard question for me. I do find that my poems have seasons, but another thing, you're going to think that I think that I'm 104, but I'm not. I'm only 103. But as I've gotten, again, as I've gotten older, I used to think a lot more about, I used to fuss a lot more about my poems and what I was doing and what they are, et cetera, in the moment that I was doing them. And then there was a time when I realized that my poems were undergoing some great change and I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't even know if they were poems. I didn't recognize them. I didn't understand them. That's when I was going from the 7-page poems about Kepler right to the little, 8-line poems about Henry. And so I just threw them all into a file, actually, and often into the wrong files all over my computer. And then a year later, I went and I got them all out again and started to work. And I thought, well, I don't know what they are. I'll just send them out. And I started sending them out. So I'm still very much in a space where I think my writing has changed this year, but I'm not sure yet at this point to what extent. And almost everything that I read tonight was written really before the beginning of the pandemic, or maybe at the very beginning. So the one, I'm sick of grief, already I was sick of grief, and I think that was only maybe last March, right? So, just after everything had started. And then the stuff that's really new right now, I'm not yet to the point of looking at it or understanding it. I find it very distasteful at the moment. I don't like it, but I'm hoping that won't last.
I think it's interesting what you said, Katharine, about, well, I can't quote you, but your idea was that once you write a poem or publish it or read it so people have seen it and heard it, it doesn't really belong to you anymore, because each reader is going to take from it what personal experience they connect to. And that's a little bit hard sometimes, to hear someone discussing your poem and maybe they have a completely different idea about a line, or, but wait, no. But yes, because the poem becomes interactive as soon as you put it out there in the world, and you lose all control over it. So
I have a poem called From Space that appeared in poetry, and I called it my love song to the National Security Agency, because it was actually about my realization that I was being constantly surveilled from space by satellites. And a woman who I didn't know at all wrote me an email from the other side of the country saying how much comfort she got from this poem, because she felt like her husband was watching her from heaven. And I just thought, great. I'm so glad.
Yeah.
Here's a question. Both of you have talked a little bit about, well, Kate, you talked directly about writing shorter poems these days. And Anna, from having spent lots of time with your manuscript, I know that you have these big, expansive poems, as well as these much more compact, beautifully compressed poems. So could you talk a little bit about what's different for you in writing a short poem versus longer poems? And what you think makes poems of either of those lengths successful or compelling?
You go, Kate.
Oh, I thought it was your turn to go.
Well, I will answer that, because, poets who write prose poems are always in an argument with the world. For some reason, people who don't maybe read a lot of poetry or even enjoy poetry get really interested in arguing about whether prose poems are really poems at all. So I have had that discussion with people. And it's interesting to me, because my big fat giant long poems are usually prose poems. And what does make a prose poem a poem and not prose? Well, if my students are in this audience, they'll recognize this. They're poems because I say they are. Whether something's a poem is up to the poet. But I guess it's a matter of, in the longer poems, of really trying to find that imagery and that poetic language and that poetic phrasing that does set a longer poem apart from just a nice piece of prose. And it's not always I mean, I know you'll relate to this, Kate, it's not always a firm line. There's a lot of wiggle room there.
I agree. There's a huge amount of wiggle room. What I tell my students, and then we can argue about it, right, is that a prose poem keeps its time in sentences, and a poem keeps its time in lines. It's really very much a matter of timekeeping for me. My long poems were lined poems, and to tell you the truth, I think they were long because I had not yet given up my feeling that I could control not only the poem, but the reader's experience of the poem. So I wanted to put a lot of stuff in there in order to, I was like the Australian shepherd of poets, that I was constantly running around and in and out and trying to figure out the reader and make sure that, that everything was in there. Yeah, and then I just reached a point where I thought, I don't need to exercise that kind of control anymore. I'm much more interested in music and in the light hand and the brief stroke in the poem, and in what done in that small space. And Kepler will be famous without me forever, and he doesn't need me.
Yeah.
I think we have we're right at 8 o'clock, but I'm going to ask you one more question. I think a more performance than about the poetry itself, but what helps ease your nerves if you get...
I didn't hear the end of that question. What
You
helps
glitched, yeah.
if we get...
If you get nervous when you read, like say at a reading such as this, what helps ease your nerves?
Kate, I may be a sociopath because I don't get nervous. So I get very nervous about some things, but not about reading. I'm more nervous putting it on the page than I am sharing it with the world. So I'm not good for answering that.
I don't really get nervous, but I do get some adrenaline,
Mhm.
which I find useful.
Mhm.
So I think that maybe what I do with that is overperform a little bit, but nobody ever complains to me about that. So I think
Your reading is beautiful. Your reading was really beautiful, Kate.
so I'm a little freaked out with the Zoom thing, that I can't see my audience. I was trained in theater as a young person, and so I really learned how to feed off an audience. And then, of course, Anna, as you know, and Lisa too, right? Teaching is all about that audience interaction.
Yeah.
So I love to read whenever I can, but I much prefer a live audience than Zoom.
You know, Katharine, it's so interesting. I know we're winding up, Lisa, but something Katharine said really interests me because I'm also a trained actor. And I think that part of what makes some people very afraid to read and perform and other people love it is just almost a mental interpretation of that adrenaline. What I experience as energy and power and passion, someone else is experiencing the same, I think the same hormonal flow as terror.
Yeah.
And possibly people can just reframe that. Do you agree with that, Kate?
I absolutely agree with that. And I tell my graduate students something that a yoga instructor told me years ago, although I think it's not true, that if you tighten the triangle where your solar plexus is, right, where your rib cage comes together, that inhibits the flow of adrenaline. And I actually think there's no scientific basis whatsoever for that. But everyone I've told to do that says that it works at least a little. And I think that that's just because you're distracting yourself, right, from the nervousness.
I want to thank everyone and thank...
Can I ask a question before you close?
Sure, sure.
How long will I know that our books are in the book fair. How long will the book fair be available? Is it running for the length of the festival?
Forever. The answer is forever.
Oh, yeah.
It's been up for a couple of months and it will remain up for a couple of months. But that said, of course, I keep putting it in the chat. There is a link to buy their books. Just click on the cover and it'll take you right to a place to buy it. And I urge you all to do that. So,
Thank you.
I was just going to say that same thing, but I put it in the chat instead. Thanks everyone for coming tonight. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Anna, for your beautiful readings. Thank you, Paisley, for organizing this festival and the true feast that it is for poetry. I think it's time to say goodnight.
Yes, thank you so much. Nice to meet you, Anna.
it is, and my husband again, how does he know how to do this? It is time to say goodnight, and I want to thank you all. This is a beautiful opening to a beautiful weekend. I'm really excited everyone joined, and I want all of you to rush out, buy books, and go. And please, if you're interested in seeing my husband cook breakfast, you can watch another panel tomorrow morning, and lunch. There's yet another panel. So check out our festival schedule. Thank you so much, Kate and Anna. That was a beautiful reading, and the questions were marvelous, and I appreciate you all. So have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Easily.
All right.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Bye.